A quiet Tuesday morning in Fairview turns explosive when Officer Brent McAllister targets a stranger sipping black coffee at Henderson's Café. What he doesn't know, that stranger is Colonel David Mercer, a man commanding 2,500 troops and holding top security clearance. One reckless stop will unravel 8 years of hidden abuse. Stay hooked. Subscribe now, hit like, and share this story, so more people hear what power looks like when challenged. It was a Tuesday morning, 8 o'clock sharp, when the rhythm of Fairview moved like clockwork through Henderson's Café. The neon open sign buzzed in the front window, throwing a faint red glow across the street, where the town still rubbed the sleep from its eyes. Inside, the familiar smells of sizzling bacon and fresh brewed coffee wrapped around the chrome counters, and red vinyl stools that had seen 40 years of stories told and forgotten. Harold Pierce was, as always, on the third booth from the left, crossword pencil in hand, tapping it against his teeth in search of the right 5-letter word. Lydia Ramos poured her fourth pot of the morning greeting customers with the same bright voice she had perfected in 15 years of double shifts. And in the corner, 16-year-old Tommy Jackson scribbled in his sketchbook, drawing the outlines of a diner scene that was about to become history. But there was one face that didn't fit the routine: Colonel David Mercer. For the past 3 weeks, he had arrived every Tuesday morning at precisely 8 o'clock, ordered nothing but a black coffee, and taken the same stool at the counter. He spoke politely, but sparingly, "Thank you, much obliged," and left a generous tip folded neatly under the mug. His presence was unusual in Fairview, a town where strangers were noticed before they made it through the second cup of coffee. And yet Mercer carried himself with a calm so steady that no one dared ask too many questions. He sat tall, back straight, his posture betraying decades of military discipline. He looked not like a man waiting for trouble, but like one who had already lived through it and had no need to announce himself. At 8:32, the door swung open, and Officer Brent McAllister stepped in. He filled the room the way thunder does before a storm, loud before he even spoke. McAllister was 8 years into his career as Fairview's most visible cop, and in that time he had built a reputation that lived in the tension between fear and familiarity. Some townsfolk said he was just doing his job, keeping order in a place where order had always been prized. Others whispered of the 42 complaints buried in the chief's desk drawer, stories of traffic stops that ended with humiliation of young men handcuffed for walking home, of women threatened when they dared to question his authority. McAllister carried those whispers the way he carried his badge, like proof that he owned the room. His boots thudded against the checkered floor as his gaze swept across the café. Harold Pierce looked down at his crossword. Lydia poured too quickly, spilling a thin stream of coffee on the counter before she caught herself. Tommy Jackson raised his eyes just long enough to meet McAllister's stare, then dropped them to his sketchbook, as if the pencil could protect him. McAllister gave them all half a glance before his eyes fixed on Mercer. There he was, a stranger who didn't shrink, a black man who didn't fidget or avoid eye contact, a customer who came week after week but never explained himself. To McAllister, calmness looked like arrogance, silence sounded like disrespect, and composure, especially from a man like Mercer, felt like open defiance. Mercer didn't move when McAllister stepped closer. He simply folded the corner of his newspaper and sipped his coffee, the motion so steady it seemed to mock the authority bearing down on him. He had seen men like McAllister before in desert checkpoints, where young soldiers waved rifles to mask their fear, in foreign outposts, where uniforms tried to stretch power they didn't fully understand. Men who confused intimidation with respect. Men who needed obedience the way others needed air. Mercer knew the type, and he had long ago decided how to meet them, not with escalation, but with silence that could not be bent. To the people of Henderson's Café, the silence was deafening. It pressed against the glass, sat heavy in the booths, made the bacon grease crackle louder in the pan. Lydia froze mid-step. Harold stopped mid-clue. Tommy's pencil hung above the page. Everyone knew the pattern McAllister had locked onto a target. And when that happened, the only question left was how far he would push before someone broke. McAllister's hand dropped instinctively to his belt, resting near the holster, a gesture as much for the audience as for himself. He had built his reputation on moments like this, on reminding the town that his badge was the highest law in the room. He leaned forward slightly, his voice pitched low but sharp enough to carry. "Morning," he said. But it wasn't a greeting, it was a warning. Mercer looked up, his gaze level, unshaken. He gave a polite nod, then set his cup back on the counter. No words, no apology. Just the stillness of a man who knew his own authority so well that he didn't need to declare it. That nod, small, almost invisible, landed like a spark in dry tinder. To McAllister, it wasn't respect. It was defiance. He felt the heat rise in his chest, a flare of anger that had nothing to do with what Mercer had done, and everything to do with what he hadn't done. He hadn't flinched, hadn't folded, hadn't fed the fragile ego of the man in uniform. 8 years of unchecked authority spoke louder than reason. 42 buried complaints had taught McAllister that there were no consequences for pushing further. And the silence of the room told him the same story again. No one would stop him, not here, not today. So he made his decision reckless, as it was inevitable. This stranger, this man of calmness and composure, would be his target. He would strip away the silence until it cracked. He would turn the calm into fear. He would make Colonel David Mercer bend, if only to remind Fairview who held the power in this town. What McAllister didn't know, what no one in Henderson's Café knew, was that David Mercer wasn't just another stranger. He was a colonel in the United States military, the commanding officer of Ironwood Base, responsible for 2,500 personnel and the classified systems that defended their entire region. His clearance was so high that even McAllister's chief wouldn't have been able to read the files he signed each week. He had sat in rooms where mistakes meant not an angry customer but global crisis. He carried authority measured not in traffic stops but in national security. And yet here he was drinking black coffee in a small-town cafe, seeking nothing more than a sliver of peace in a life built on crisis. That peace was about to shatter, not because of any crime, not because of any threat, but because one officer saw calmness as defiance and silence as a challenge. By the time the clock above the counter ticked to 8:36, Henderson's Café was no longer just a diner. It was a stage. On one side, a man who believed his badge made him untouchable. On the other, a man who had lived through wars and command rooms, and whose authority reached far beyond the walls of Fairview. The clash was inevitable. And it would not end with the silence McAllister mistook for surrender. It would end with the shattering of the illusion that power and authority were the same thing. The clock above the counter struck 8:36 when Officer Brent McAllister closed the distance between himself and the quiet man at the counter. The sound of his boots against the black and white tiles was heavy, deliberate, as if each step were meant to prove that this room belonged to him. For 8 years that stride had silenced conversations, ended arguments, and made ordinary men lower their eyes. But on this Tuesday morning, the sound met an immovable calm seated on the third red stool from the left. Colonel David Mercer didn't flinch. His shoulders remained square, his back straight, his posture betraying the decades of discipline forged in barracks, battlefields and briefing rooms where hesitation could cost lives. He turned one page of his folded newspaper, His hand steady his face, expressionless. It was a small gesture, but in McAllister's world, it was an act of war. "Let's see some identification." McAllister demanded, his tone sharp, dripping with the arrogance of a man who had never been told no by anyone with the power to enforce it. His hand shifted on his belt, close enough to his holster to remind everyone watching that his badge wasn't just a symbol, it came with a gun. The diner went silent. Lydia Ramos froze with the coffee pot, mid-pour, her knuckles white from gripping the handle. Harold Pierce's pencil hovered above the crossword forgotten. 16-year-old Tommy Jackson held his breath, his eyes darting between the officer and the stranger. It was as if the whole cafe had turned into a stage with every regular cast as witness to a drama they couldn't control. Mercer moved slowly, unhurried. He slid his hand into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a black leather wallet. The motion was precise, not rushed, not defensive, but measured. He placed it on the counter next to the steaming mug of coffee. He didn't open it. He didn't explain himself. He simply rested his hand lightly on top of it, as if reminding McAllister that choice was still his. The silence burned McAllister more than words ever could. In his world, silence was disrespect. Calmness was provocation. He leaned closer, lowering his voice, so only Mercer could hear, though the cafe's silence made every word echo. "You think sitting here quiet makes you special? Makes you better than this town?" McAllister hissed. "You don't get to come here week after week and act like you don't owe anyone answers." Mercer finally lifted his eyes. They were steady, dark, unshaken. He spoke softly, his words low enough to force McAllister to listen, but clear enough that the nearby booths could hear every syllable. "Officer, I've broken no laws. I've disturbed no peace. I've caused no harm. I come here for coffee. Nothing more." The words carried no anger, no defensiveness, just fact. They were delivered in the same tone Mercer might have used in a briefing room when explaining coordinates to a group of officers. Calm, certain, final. But for McAllister, certainty wasn't closure. It was a challenge. His jaw tightened, his face flushing red. He leaned even closer, so near that his breath stirred the newspaper on the counter. "You don't sit in my town week after week without answering questions," he said. "You're gonna tell me who you are, or I'll find out another way." What McAllister didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the man in front of him wasn't some drifter avoiding questions. Colonel David Mercer commanded 2,500 military personnel at Ironwood Base, a sprawling defense installation hidden among 12,000 acres of forested hills just beyond Fairview's borders. Mercer's clearance level was so high that even most members of Congress weren't authorized to read the files on his desk. He oversaw missile defense systems, cyber warfare operations, and crisis protocols designed to protect millions of American lives. He was, in the simplest terms, one of the most powerful men to ever sip black coffee in Henderson's Café. And yet none of that power showed in his expression. Mercer didn't puff his chest or rattle off his credentials. He simply placed his hand back on the folded newspaper, eyes still fixed on McAllister, his silence louder than the officer's threats. For a moment, McAllister faltered. The stillness unsettled him. He was used to fidgeting excuses, even tears. He was used to people cracking under the weight of his stare and the proximity of his badge. But this man, this stranger, sat like a mountain, unmoved, unshakable. The tension spread through the cafe like a storm front. Lydia's throat tightened as she glanced toward the door, as if hoping someone else would walk in and dissolve the moment. Harold's hand trembled slightly, a faint pencil smudge spreading across the crossword box he had been holding for too long. Tommy's eyes were wide, his pencil suspended above the page, sketching nothing, recording everything. McAllister straightened up, forcing a laugh that rang hollow in the silence. "Right," he said loudly. performing for the room as much as for Mercer. Another one of those who thinks he's too good for the rules. We'll see about that. Mercer nodded once the motion subtle but deliberate, as if sealing the exchange. He didn't look away, didn't offer apology or explanation. The colonel had faced men with far more dangerous weapons and far greater authority than Brent McAllister's badge. He had negotiated with foreign generals, made life-or-death calls in the span of minutes, and overseen operations where silence was the only thing keeping soldiers alive. Compared to that, this small-town officer was nothing more than a noise in the background. But noise has power when no one else speaks. And in Fairview, silence from the community had allowed McAllister's noise to grow unchecked for 8 long years. He mistook their compliance for respect, their fear for validation. And now, in this diner, he mistook Mercer's silence for surrender. The decision crystallized in McAllister's mind, reckless and absolute. He would make this stranger bend. He would strip away the calm until it cracked. He would force words out of that measured mouth, if only to prove that no one could sit in his cafe in his town and ignore the authority of his badge. But what Brent McAllister failed to see was that he wasn't the one holding power in this room. The calm man on the stool commanded more authority than he could ever imagine. And by choosing him as a target, McAllister wasn't asserting control, he was lighting the fuse of his own downfall, one that would reach far beyond Henderson's Café, past Fairview's quiet streets, and into halls of federal power, where his badge meant nothing at all. At 8:41, the clock ticked again. The room exhaled, but the silence didn't break. In that moment, a battle had been declared not with fists, not with guns, but with posture tone, and the chasm between false power and true authority. The second hand on the clock above the counter slid to 8:42, and the air inside Henderson's Café felt like it had thickened. Not a soul moved. The café, usually alive with the clink of silverware, the scrape of forks against plates, and Lydia Ramos's cheerful chatter, had fallen into a silence so deep it pressed against the walls. Only the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint hiss of the coffee pot reminded anyone that time was still moving forward. Lydia stood frozen mid-step, a half-filled mug trembling in her hand. She had poured coffee for Colonel David Mercer for 3 straight weeks, without incident, noting his politeness, his quiet nods, his generous tips. She'd told her daughter once, almost in passing, he's the kind of man who makes a place feel steadier, like he belongs, even if no one knows his story. Now, watching Officer Brent McAllister square off against him, she felt that steadiness threatened, and a pit opened in her stomach. Should she speak? Should she intervene? Her hand shook as the coffee rippled dangerously close to the rim of the mug. Harold Pierce, 70 years old, sat 2 booths away, his crossword puzzle abandoned. He had lived in Fairview his entire life, long enough to see how authority worked here. McAllister had been a bully since his teenage years. Harold remembered complaints from the high school teachers' fights that somehow always ended with Brent walking away unpunished. 8 years into wearing a badge, Brent had turned that arrogance into procedure. Harold's pencil hovered above a half-filled box that should have been simple 3 letters, Sun God, but his mind couldn't focus. He watched the officer lean closer to Mercer, his hand near the holster, his voice sharp with command, and Harold's chest tightened. He wanted to say something, anything, but his voice stuck in his throat like dust. In the corner booth, 16-year-old Tommy Jackson stared wide-eyed at the scene unfolding less than 20 feet from him. His sketchbook lay open on the table, pencil frozen mid-line. He had drawn plenty of things, trains, cars, even portraits of Lydia when she smiled at him, but never had he tried to sketch the weight of fear pressing against his chest now. He wanted to capture Mercer's calm, the way the man didn't flinch, didn't fold, even as McAllister's tone sharpened. It was unlike anything Tommy had ever seen, one man refusing to move, while another wearing a badge bristled with manufactured authority. He didn't know which detail to capture Mercer's stillness, or the way the entire cafe seemed to hold its breath around him. McAllister's laugh, loud, forced, jagged, cut through the silence, but no one joined in. The sound hung in the air like a challenge, daring someone to break the tension to side with him. No one did. The silence wasn't agreement, though. It was fear. Fear of what might happen if they spoke. Fear of what McAllister had done before and what he could do again. In 8 years, he had taught Fairview that silence was survival. Citizens who filed complaints learned quickly that their lives could become difficult traffic stops, fines, late-night knocks on the door. Even fellow officers had learned to keep their distance. The silence now was heavy with that history. But there was something else beneath the fear, something sharper, harder to name. Disbelief. Because Colonel Mercer wasn't folding. His silence wasn't the silence of submission. It was the silence of strength. Every person in that cafe felt it, even if they couldn't articulate it, the difference between a man who yields because he is weak and a man who refuses because he is unbreakable. Mercer's stillness made McAllister look smaller, his badge less weighty, his threats more hollow. It was a reversal no one had expected to witness, least of all in Henderson's Café on a Tuesday morning. Lydia's heart hammered in her chest. She wanted to step forward to say something that might diffuse the confrontation. But she thought of her son, 16 like Tommy, who would be driving alone soon. She thought of the power McAllister held over the streets of Fairview and how quickly he could make her family's life unbearable. So she remained silent, her eyes darting to Mercer's face as if to say, "I see you. I respect you. But I can't help you." Harold adjusted his glasses, pretending to glance back at his crossword, though the page blurred before him. He thought of his late wife, how she used to scold him for letting men like McAllister walk unchecked. "Silence is complicity, Harold," she used to say. Yet here he was, lips pressed tight, body frozen, unable to summon the courage to speak, even though every instinct told him this moment was different. Tommy, though, felt something else entirely. His pencil scratched against the paper without him realizing, tracing Mercer's shoulders, his posture, the stillness in his gaze. He thought of the comic books he loved where heroes never flinched in the face of danger. But this wasn't fiction. This was a man real, and breathing, refusing to bow to a badge waved like a weapon. Tommy didn't have words for it yet, but he knew he was watching something that mattered, something he would remember for the rest of his life. McAllister misread the silence as he always did. To him, it was validation. He believed the room was with him, that their quiet meant agreement rather than fear. He believed Mercer was alone. But Mercer knew better. He could read a room with the precision of a strategist, and he saw the truth in their eyes, the fear, yes, but also the cracks of doubt forming. He didn't need their words. Their silence was enough to tell him they were watching, weighing, reconsidering. The clock ticked to 8:47. 5 minutes had passed since McAllister first demanded identification, though to the people in the cafe it felt like an hour. In those 5 minutes, a town's long-held assumptions about authority were being tested. Could calmness stand against arrogance? Could silence defy power? Could one man's refusal to bend reveal the fragility of another's control? Lydia shifted her weight, finally setting down the coffee pot, with a clatter louder than intended. The sound startled her, but she caught Mercer's eye for just a fraction of a second. His calmness steadied her hands. She inhaled, exhaled, and stepped back. Harold forced himself to write the answer, Ra, the sun god, into his crossword box, Though his hand shook so badly, the letters wavered. He wasn't solving a puzzle. He was marking the page to remind himself later that he had witnessed something that unsettled him more deeply than he cared to admit. Tommy finished his sketch. It wasn't perfect, but it captured what mattered: the badge on McAllister's chest puffed up like armor, and the man on the stool still as stone, coffee mug in hand. The drawing trembled with the tension of the moment, but it carried a truth Tommy couldn't yet voice. He closed the book quietly, pressing his palm over it as if holding the scene inside for safekeeping. By 8:50, the air in Henderson's Café was so charged it felt as though one wrong word could spark something irreversible. The diners sat paralyzed, each trapped between fear of McAllister's retribution and awe at Mercer's composure. They bore witness to injustice, yet said nothing. Their silence was both shield and prison. But even in that silence, something unspoken stirred a recognition that true authority had nothing to do with swagger, nothing to do with a badge flashed like a weapon. True authority sat calmly on a stool, sipping black coffee, daring arrogance to collapse under its own weight. By 9:15 that morning, Colonel David Mercer had already returned to Ironwood Base, leaving Henderson's Café behind as if nothing unusual had happened. To him, the exchange was just another encounter with arrogance, masquerading as authority, a pattern he had witnessed in war-torn nations and fragile regimes now replayed in small-town America. But unlike the other patrons, Mercer carried with him a duty. Silence could shield him in the moment, but documentation could expose the truth. At 9:45, he sat in his office, a dark sedan parked outside the concrete headquarters of Ironwood. His desk was a fortress of precision files, stacked in neat rows, pens aligned perfectly, a digital clock blinking in green. He opened a fresh report, typed the date, and began recording the incident with the same discipline he applied to battlefield briefings. On Tuesday morning, 0932 hours, he wrote, I was approached by Officer Brent McAllister of the Fairview Police Department while conducting routine community engagement at Henderson's Café. Officer McAllister demanded identification without probable cause, made statements suggesting racial bias and implied retaliation if my background was found untruthful. Every line was factual, stripped of emotion built on observation. Mercer did not embellish. He did not need to. His report carried the weight of credibility, the authority of a man trusted with decisions that affected millions. When he finished, he signed his name with the precision of a commander, Colonel David Mercer, commanding officer, Ironwood Base. Back in Fairview, rumors spread like wildfire before noon. Lydia Ramos, shaken by what she had seen, couldn't shake Mercer's steady eyes from her memory. She told herself she shouldn't get involved, shouldn't stir waters already too deep. But when she returned home at 2 o'clock, curiosity gnawed at her. She opened her laptop, typed David Mercer Military into the search bar, and hit Enter. The results were sparse, frustratingly so. A handful of Department of Defense press releases, citations in military journals, a photograph of Mercer standing stiff-backed beside a row of generals, his uniform heavy with medals. No social media, no personal details. It was as if his life outside the base didn't exist. But what she did find unsettled her. Ironwood Base wasn't just another facility. It spanned 12,000 acres of restricted land, with radar arrays hidden among the trees, missile defense silos buried beneath reinforced earth, and a security clearance structure so tight even state officials struggled to get near. Mercer wasn't just some officer on leave. He was the commander, the man at the top. The man Fairview's arrogant cop had decided to corner over coffee. By 4 o'clock, Lydia had shared her findings with her sister, who shared them with her neighbor, who whispered them to her husband at the hardware store. By dinner time, half the town had heard that the quiet stranger at Henderson's Café wasn't a drifter, but a colonel. The mystery deepened the story, bent under speculation. Some said he was CIA. Others claimed nuclear codes. A few dismissed it outright, unwilling to believe that such a man would sit quietly at their local counter. Meanwhile, the other half of the story began to crawl from the shadows. Brent McAllister's name had lingered on complaint forms, whispered in court hallways, muttered at kitchen tables for 8 long years. Officially, he was effective assertive, dedicated to order. Unofficially, he was trouble. By 7 o'clock that evening, the first calls were made quiet conversations between townsfolk who had been silenced before. Maria Martinez remembered the night McAllister pulled her over, accused her of reckless driving when she was simply heading home from a late shift, then threatened to make things worse if she filed a complaint. She had filed anyway, only to receive a letter 3 weeks later, insufficient evidence. Jerome Washington, now a freshman at the State University, still carried the memory of being forced to the ground after basketball practice. His hands cuffed behind his back, McAllister's voice dripping with racial venom. His parents had gone to the station demanding answers. The chief had nodded sympathetically, promised review, then buried the report. 42 complaints in total. 6 years' worth of patterns stacked in a hidden drawer at the Fairview Police Department. Excessive force. Racial bias. Retaliation against citizens who dared to speak. Each one buried, dismissed, explained away by paperwork that said unsubstantiated when the truth was anything but. At 8 o'clock, Sharp, the mayor's assistant, picked up the phone and called Chief Allen Drummond. "Have you heard the rumor?" she asked, voice tight. Drummond had. Everyone had. That the stranger McAllister had confronted was no stranger at all. That he held clearance levels beyond the chief's imagination. That the man could, with a single report, place their entire department under federal scrutiny. Drummond cursed quietly, pacing his office. McAllister was a headache. He had long tolerated a problem protected by political convenience. But this was different. If Mercer filed formal complaints, if federal eyes turned toward Fairview, those 42 buried incidents would not stay buried. They would be exhumed, each one a nail in the coffin of his career. Meanwhile, at Henderson's Café, Tommy Jackson sat with his sketchbook open, replaying the morning in pencil lines. His drawing of Mercer was strong, steady, unflinching. His drawing of McAllister was different lines, jagged posture, forced eyes, angry but hollow. When Lydia passed his booth, she stopped staring at the sketch in silence. She didn't say a word, but the image confirmed what she had felt all along: authority and power were not the same. One man had both. The other had only a badge. By 10 o'clock that night, the story of Mercer and McAllister had spread beyond Fairview. A cousin in the neighboring county posted about it online, and soon comments poured in. Some defended McAllister, clinging to the idea that order required force. Others, emboldened, shared their own stories of stops, threats, silenced complaints. The dam was cracking, the silence splintering. And while the town wrestled with rumors, Mercer's report moved quietly up the chain of command. By 11:30, it was on the desk of an FBI liaison in the regional office. By midnight, Agent Naomi Chen of the Civil Rights Division had it flagged in her inbox, her sharp eyes narrowing as she read the words, "Racial bias, intimidation, implied retaliation." 42 buried complaints had shielded Brent McAllister for nearly a decade. But all it took was one report, factual, precise, signed by a colonel with top-tier clearance, to drag them into the light. And for the first time, Fairview stood on the edge of a reckoning. By dawn the next morning, the incident at Henderson's Café had already slipped into the rhythm of small-town gossip. Some told it as a funny misunderstanding, an officer doing his job, a stranger too stubborn to cooperate. Others whispered it with unease, the way you might whisper about a storm forming on the horizon. But by 8 o'clock, far beyond Fairview's quiet streets, the story had landed on the desk of someone whose job was to recognize storms before they broke. Agent Naomi Chen sat in her office on the 22nd floor of a federal building, 3 states away, a mug of green tea steaming beside her keyboard. At 39 years old, she had built a reputation in the FBI's Civil Rights Division. As the agent who noticed details, others ignored the one who saw patterns not as coincidences, but as warnings. She had dismantled police cover-ups in 2 different states and successfully prosecuted a sheriff's department that had hidden nearly 60 incidents of misconduct. So when Colonel David Mercer's report crossed her screen at precisely 8:15 that morning, flagged with urgent review, she didn't skim it. She read it once, then twice, then a third time, her pen tapping against the desk with a rhythm that meant trouble for someone. The language was clinical, the tone restrained, but the weight was unmistakable. Demanded identification without probable cause. Statements suggesting racial bias. Implied retaliation. These weren't the words of a citizen frustrated after a bad traffic stop. These were the words of a commander, a man trained to document facts for military tribunals and congressional hearings. More than that, Chen knew Mercer by reputation. His clearance level was among the highest in the country. If he had taken the time to write this, it wasn't petty. It was serious. By 9 o'clock, Chen had pulled McAllister's record. What she saw confirmed her instincts. 42 complaints in 8 years. 42. Most officers never reached half that number in an entire career. She scanned the summaries: unnecessary use of force, racially motivated stops, retaliation against citizens who filed complaints. Each one neatly stamped with the same conclusion: unsubstantiated. Chen didn't believe in coincidences. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. 42 complaints don't vanish by accident, she murmured. Behind every buried report was a system, a hand that pushed the paper into a drawer, a chief who signed off on silence. She scribbled the name on her notepad: Chief Alan Drummond. By 10:30, Chen convened a small task force in the glass-walled conference room. 4 agents joined her laptops, glowing files spread across the table. She outlined the basics. We have a decorated military officer, Colonel David Mercer, reporting racial bias and intimidation by Officer Brent McAllister of the Fairview Police Department. 42 prior complaints against McAllister, all buried. This points not to an individual problem, but a systemic failure. We are opening an inquiry. Her team began digging. They requested internal affairs records from Fairview, though Chen knew they would arrive sanitized if at all. They searched for citizen lawsuits, local news archives, federal grant records tied to the police department. Patterns began to emerge by noon. McAllister had been promoted twice despite the complaints. Fairview PD had received nearly $2 million in federal funding over the past decade, money contingent on compliance with civil rights protections. And Chief Alan Drummond's name appeared repeatedly in local council minutes defending McAllister as an effective officer keeping Fairview safe. At 1 o'clock, Chen called Mercer directly. The line clicked and his voice came steady, clipped the cadence of a man accustomed to secure communications. She introduced herself, explained her role, then asked, "Colonel, are you prepared for this to escalate into a formal investigation?" There was a pause. Then Mercer answered. Agent Chen, I've faced down regimes overseas that thrived on intimidation and silence. I know what that looks like, and I see the same pattern here. If my report helps expose it, then yes. Proceed. By 2 o'clock, Chen's team was drafting subpoenas. They compiled a preliminary file, Mercer's report summaries of McAllister's complaints, sworn affidavits from 2 citizens who had filed grievances and been ignored. They began mapping connections, names of officers, who had witnessed incidents but never testified, city officials who had dismissed community concerns, budget records showing money allocated for oversight programs that mysteriously never materialized. By 3:30, Chen briefed her section chief. "This isn't just misconduct," she said. "It's institutional protection. Drummond has shielded McAllister for years. We have enough to justify a full civil rights inquiry." The section chief nodded grimly. "Proceed. But tread carefully. If Mercer's right, this ties into national security. The military doesn't like its commanders being harassed by small-town cops." At 4 o'clock, Chief Drummond sat in his office, sweat collecting under his collar. Word had reached him already. A friend in the mayor's office had whispered that federal eyes were turning toward Fairview. He pulled McAllister's personnel file from the locked drawer in his desk, flipping through the complaints. 42 pieces of paper, each one a liability he had stamped unsubstantiated. His stomach tightened. He had thought burying them protected the department. Now they might bury him. By 6 o'clock, the rumor mill churned again. Lydia Ramos overheard two men at the grocery store debating whether Mercer was some kind of spook or just a colonel. Harold Pierce's neighbor told him federal agents had been seen near Town Hall, though Harold suspected that was more gossip than fact. Tommy Jackson sat at his desk, sketchbook open, drawing a badge splitting down the middle, though he didn't fully understand why his hand drew it that way. By 8 that evening, Chen's task force had enough evidence to justify sending a formal notification to Fairview. A letter drafted on FBI letterhead, crisp and cold, informed Chief Drummond that the Civil Rights Division had opened an investigation into potential violations of constitutional rights by his department. The letter requested access to personnel files, body camera footage, and internal communications. It was the kind of letter that made careers tremble. At 9:15, Chen closed her laptop, the city skyline glittering behind her office window. She sipped the last of her green tea and thought of Mercer sitting calmly in that diner, refusing to bend. His silence had been stronger than McAllister's threats, and now it had reached her desk, unraveling a system 8 years in the making. By 10 o'clock, Fairview was quiet, but the silence was different from the mornings. It wasn't the silence of complicity or fear. It was the silence before impact, before federal boots touched small-town ground, before the weight of accountability settled on a department that had buried 42 truths too many. And somewhere in his modest home, Officer Brent McAllister flicked through television channels, blissfully unaware that the storm had already formed, and that its center was moving swiftly toward him. By 7 o'clock the following morning, the news had reached Fairview's mayor, Richard Calloway, in the form of a short-clipped phone call from a council member who could barely contain his panic. "They're saying federal agents are sniffing around," the man blurted. "It's about McAllister, about what he did at Henderson's Café. And Mayor, it involves Colonel Mercer. Ironwood Base." Calloway sat at his kitchen table, staring at his untouched breakfast. The mention of Ironwood Base froze him more than the words federal agents. For 12 years, the mayor had staked his political reputation and the town's stability on maintaining a smooth relationship with that base. Ironwood wasn't just another military installation. It was Fairview's lifeline. The base employed nearly 3,000 civilians, from mechanics to cooks to office clerks. Local shops thrived on off-duty personnel, buying groceries, furniture, and car repairs. Restaurants filled with uniformed service members on weekends. The town's housing market depended on steady demand from military families. Ironwood wasn't just a neighbor, it was Fairview's beating heart, pumping millions of dollars into the local economy every year. By 8 o'clock, Calloway was pacing his office in Town Hall, his tie loosened, his brow furrowed. He had always thought of McAllister as a nuisance, a man whose arrogance brought complaints, but never real consequences. Chief Drummond had assured him time and again that Brent is aggressive, yes, but effective. He keeps order. The mayor had accepted it, even defended it, because it seemed easier than confronting the truth. But now, with one confrontation in a diner, that choice threatened everything. If Mercer filed an official complaint and Calloway knew he already had, the Department of Defense could restrict Ironwood personnel from leaving the base on their off hours. That meant no more shopping trips downtown, no more dinners at family-owned restaurants, no more leases signed in Fairview's neighborhoods. Within weeks, businesses would start bleeding money. Within months, families would move away. At 8:30, Calloway called an emergency meeting with his economic advisor, Sarah Layton. She arrived breathless, a folder clutched in her hands. "Mayor," she said, "if Ironwood pulls back, the numbers are catastrophic. We're talking a 25% hit to local revenue within the first quarter. Some businesses won't survive the year." Calloway pressed his palms against his desk, the wood cool under his skin. All this he muttered, because one officer couldn't leave a man to his coffee. By 9:15, the weight of his political career pressed down on him. He had spent more than a decade cultivating Fairview's image as a model town, safe, orderly, prosperous. He had cut ribbons, given speeches, shaken hands with colonels and generals at Ironwood. He had even pitched Fairview as a future hub for defense contractors. If federal oversight declared his police department toxic, all of that would crumble. At 10 o'clock, he summoned Chief Drummond. The chief arrived, sweat beading under his uniform cap, a folder tucked under his arm. He dropped it on the mayor's desk. 42, he said grimly. Calloway frowned. 42, what? Complaints, Drummond admitted. Over 6 years, all against McAllister. Most dismissed, some buried. Nothing stuck. The mayor's face went pale. He opened the folder, flipping through page after page. Excessive force. Racial bias. Retaliation. Each one stamped with the familiar unsubstantiated. He shut the file, his stomach turning. Alan Calloway said slowly, "Do you realize what happens if the feds get their hands on this?" Drummond didn't answer. He didn't have to. Both men knew. Federal oversight wouldn't just remove McAllister, it would drag the entire department into the light, exposing years of complicity. By 11:30, Calloway called the city council into an emergency session. They gathered in the wood-paneled chamber, whispers filling the room like restless birds. He laid it out plainly. If Ironwood cuts ties, Fairview's economy collapses. And that collapse begins with one name, Officer Brent McAllister. Some council members gasped. Others shook their heads in disbelief. But the numbers spoke louder than the mayor's words. A quarter of the town's revenue. Hundreds of jobs. Entire neighborhoods at risk. The silence that followed was heavy with fear. By 1 o'clock, the mayor received another call, this time from Ironwood itself. Colonel Mercer's aide spoke in a voice clipped and professional. "The colonel has filed a report. He has not yet requested restrictions on base personnel. But if harassment continues, or if retaliation occurs, that option will be on the table." Calloway thanked her, though his throat was dry. Hanging up, he realized how close they already were to disaster. One more misstep from McAllister, one more buried complaint unearthed, and Ironwood could wall off its people from Fairview. At 3 o'clock, Calloway sat alone in his office, the blinds half drawn, staring at the skyline of his town. He thought of the families who had built their lives here, the mechanic who fixed Humvees on base during the day, and cars in his garage at night, the diner owner who served eggs to both locals and soldiers, the landlord whose apartments were filled with young service members. All of them balanced on the fragile thread of Fairview's relationship with Ironwood. And all of it was now threatened by a man who confused intimidation with authority. By 5 o'clock, Calloway drafted a speech for the council meeting scheduled that evening. His words were cautious, crafted to acknowledge concerns without admitting liability. But as he wrote, he felt the weight of the truth pressing down. The real dilemma wasn't political, it was moral. For years he had allowed McAllister to thrive, had nodded along when Drummond insisted the officer was just doing his job. And now that silence had a cost, one measured not only in dollars, but in dignity. At 7 o'clock the chamber filled with townspeople. Some had already heard the rumors. Lydia Ramos sat in the back, her hands folded tightly, her mind replaying Mercer's calm voice. Harold Pierce leaned on his cane, his crossword tucked in his pocket. Tommy Jackson sat beside his mother's sketchbook, hidden under his arm. They came not because they expected answers, but because they felt the tremors of change under their feet. Mayor Calloway stepped to the podium. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the strain. Ladies and gentlemen, Fairview stands at a crossroads. Our relationship with Ironwood Base is vital, economically, socially, nationally. Recent events have jeopardized that relationship. If we lose it, the consequences will be severe. I urge you to remain calm as we work with federal authorities to ensure accountability and protect our community. The words rang hollow, but the warning was clear. Fairview's future was no longer secure. It balanced on the fragile thread of accountability, one that could snap at any moment. By 9 o'clock, Calloway sat again in his office, the chamber empty, the night pressing against the windows. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in his career, he admitted the truth to himself. His dilemma was no longer about saving face. It was about survival, his, the department's, the town's. And survival now depended on whether Fairview could confront the rot it had ignored for 8 long years. By Thursday evening, just 3 days after the incident at Henderson's Café, Fairview was no longer the same quiet town it had been the week before. Whispers about Colonel David Mercer's rank, his authority, and his connection to Ironwood Base threaded through every conversation, from barbershops to grocery store aisles, from the high school bleachers to the gas station counter. The rumors had grown so large that they wrapped themselves around Officer Brent McAllister like a vice. Instead of cooling his temper, the talk ignited it. McAllister had always lived on fear. Fear kept people silent when he barked. Fear made them compliant when he demanded. But now, in hushed tones and sideways glances, he could sense that fear shifting, not disappearing entirely, but bending toward something else, toward doubt, toward Mercer. That shift was unbearable. By 7 o'clock on Friday evening, he made his choice. If the town was watching Mercer, then McAllister would stage another performance, this time bigger, louder, undeniable. He would confront Mercer publicly, not in a cafe where silence had betrayed him, but in the open where witnesses could see who held authority. It was 8:30 when McAllister spotted Mercer at the municipal library parking lot. The colonel had just finished a quiet evening meeting with 2 retired veterans men he'd served with decades ago, both now residents of Fairview. They parted ways, handshakes exchanged under the yellow glow of street lamps before Mercer walked toward his sedan, the same dark vehicle with government plates that few in town had noticed before the diner incident. McAllister pulled his patrol car into the lot spotlight, sweeping across the parked vehicles. It lingered on Mercer's sedan, a deliberate pause before the officer stepped out, boots echoing against the asphalt. "Evening, Mr. Mercer," he called, his tone clipped, falsely professional. "We've had reports of suspicious activity. Mind telling me what business you have here tonight?" Mercer stopped beside his car, turning slowly. He had faced checkpoints in deserts where guns were raised before questions were asked. He had stared down foreign officers who had accused him of espionage. He recognized the posture in McAllister's shoulders, the tone in his voice. Manufactured authority sharpened by insecurity. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. He simply reached into his coat pocket, withdrew his phone, and pressed record. The faint chime of the device echoed in the still air. "This is Colonel David Mercer," he said clearly, his voice calm but steady, carrying across the lot. "I am currently being approached by Officer Brent McAllister of the Fairview Police Department. The officer has accused me of suspicious activity without probable cause or evidence. This statement is being recorded for documentation purposes." McAllister froze, the words hitting him harder than a blow. For the first time in 8 years of unchecked authority, someone was capturing him in real time. No denials later. No buried complaints. Just raw, undeniable evidence. His jaw tightened. "Turn that off," he ordered. "No!" Mercer replied, his tone sharper this time, but still calm, unyielding. "This recording will remain active until this encounter is complete. You have accused me without cause. That is intimidation. That is harassment." The word harassment cut through McAllister's facade. He glanced around the lot, realizing the veterans had not yet left. They stood at a distance, watching quietly, their silhouettes outlined in the streetlight. And across the street, 2 teenagers leaned against their bicycles, phones already lifted, cameras pointed in his direction. This was no longer his stage alone. McAllister doubled down his pride louder than his reason. "We've had tips about drug trafficking in this area." He blurted the accusation, wild, baseless, but dressed in official language. "You fit the description." Mercer's eyebrows rose slightly. He didn't smile. He didn't flinch. He simply spoke into his phone again. "I have just been accused of drug trafficking by Officer McAllister without any supporting evidence. This statement is also being recorded." The veterans exchanged a glance, their faces grim. One of the teenagers whispered, "Did he just say drug trafficking?" The other nodded, his camera still fixed. For McAllister, the trap had closed, though he didn't realize it yet. In less than 3 minutes, he had crossed the line from arrogance into fabrication, from intimidation into unlawful accusation. His badge no longer shone as protection, it glared as evidence. By 8:45, Mercer ended the recording with a simple statement. Encounter concluded. Evidence preserved. He placed the phone back in his coat pocket, opened his car door, and slid behind the wheel. He didn't slam the door or rush the ignition. His calmness was deliberate, the kind that infuriated men like McAllister, the kind that showed true authority, needed no theatrics. McAllister stood frozen beside his patrol car, anger boiling beneath his skin. But for the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. He knew deep down that the silence that had always shielded him had cracked. Too many witnesses. Too many recordings. By 9 o'clock, the video had already spread. The teenagers uploaded their clips online, where views ticked upward by the hundreds. Lydia Ramos saw it before she went to bed, her hand trembling, as she recognized the man who had sat at her counter with nothing more than a cup of coffee and quiet dignity. Harold Pierce watched it on his grandson's phone, muttering, "So now the truth comes out." And Tommy Jackson traced the scene in his sketchbook, drawing Mercer not just as a man at a diner, but as a figure holding a mirror up to a town's long-hidden failures. By 10:30, Mercer's recording was in Agent Naomi Chen's inbox. She played it once, then again, jotting down timestamps and key phrases, suspicious activity, drug trafficking without probable cause. Her jaw tightened. This wasn't just misconduct. It was fabrication, clear as daylight, delivered in a public space with multiple witnesses. She dialed her section chief at 11, her voice calm but urgent. "We've reached the breaking point," she said. "McAllister has provided us with everything we need." And by midnight, Fairview's future had shifted. For the first time in 8 years, the silence that had protected McAllister had been replaced with undeniable evidence. Not rumors, not whispers, evidence. a recording multiple witnesses, digital proof that could not be buried in a drawer. Colonel David Mercer slept that night with the calm of a man who had endured far greater storms. McAllister did not sleep at all, and the town of Fairview lay restless, caught between fear of collapse and the faint glimmer of something it hadn't felt in years, hope that accountability might finally arrive. By 7 o'clock the next morning, the recording of McAllister's baseless accusation had already traveled farther than Fairview's gossip ever could. It had been replayed in classrooms, on phones, in grocery store lines, even whispered about in church pews. But most importantly, it sat in the inbox of Agent Naomi Chen, who had listened to it 3 times before sunrise. Each replay confirmed the same truth: McAllister had crossed a line that could not be blurred or explained away. At 8:15, Chen convened her task force. The glass-walled conference room filled with the shuffle of files, the hum of laptops, and the sharp scent of black coffee poured into paper cups. She stood at the head of the table, the recording projected on a screen behind her. McAllister's voice echoed through the room. "We've had tips about drug trafficking in this area. You fit the description." Gasps of disbelief rippled across the team, even though they were seasoned investigators. Fabricating a drug allegation wasn't just reckless, it was a textbook violation of civil rights law. Chen's voice cut through the tension. "This is not an isolated incident. This is the culmination of a pattern. 42 complaints buried. 8 years of protection. Chief Alan Drummond has shielded McAllister every step of the way. We are not dealing with a rogue officer. We are dealing with a system." By 9:30, the team had begun compiling. They gathered sworn affidavits from citizens who had once filed complaints: Maria Martinez, who had been threatened after a traffic stop; Jerome Washington, handcuffed on his walk home from basketball practice; even Officer Sarah Donovan, who had quietly documented incidents she'd witnessed but never dared to report. Dashcam footage surfaced too grainy, poorly catalogued, some conveniently missing. But what remained showed patterns. White drivers waved through checkpoints. Black drivers detained and searched. Citizens forced from cars for furtive movements that never happened. Stops escalating into force with no cause. Each clip stitched together a portrait of a man who wielded his badge like a weapon, and a department that let him. By 11 o'clock, Chen had McAllister's internal files spread across the table. 42 documented complaints over 6 years. Each one stamped unsubstantiated. Each one signed off by Chief Drummond. She tapped her pen against the file. "This isn't negligence. This is conspiracy. Drummond knew and he buried it. Which means he's complicit." At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Chen briefed the U.S. Attorney's Office. The evidence was damning, the timeline airtight. "We recommend immediate federal action," she said. "Charges violation of civil rights, conspiracy to deprive citizens of constitutional protections, obstruction of justice. Targets: Officer Brent McAllister, Chief Alan Drummond, and 3 municipal officials who enabled the cover-ups." The attorney nodded gravely. "Draft the warrants. We'll execute at dawn." By 3 o'clock, agents across the region began preparing. Teams were assigned, homes were mapped, entry points noted. The operation was to be simultaneous, swift, coordinated, leaving no chance for anyone to tip off another. Dawn was chosen deliberately, the hour when resistance is weakest, when a knock on the door carries the weight of inevitability. At 5:30 the next morning, while Fairview still slept under a blanket of fog, the agents moved. Black SUVs rolled silently through quiet streets. Tactical teams slipped into position outside homes and offices. Radios crackled softly. "Position 1 secure. Position 2 in place. Stand by for go." At 6 o'clock, sharp, the orders came. Doors swung open with shouts of federal agents. The first arrest, was McAllister himself pulled from his home in handcuffs, his face pale with disbelief. For the first time in 8 years, no badge shielded him, no chief hovered to protect him. The man who had thrived on fear now stared into the unblinking authority of federal law. Across town, at 6:05, Chief Drummond was led from his front porch, neighbors peeking from behind curtains. His face sagged, the weight of years of protection turned suddenly to liability. One shouted, "We knew!" Another whispered, "Finally." By 6:15, 2 city officials were arrested at their homes, their protests drowned out by the click of cameras and the murmurs of onlookers. At 6:20, the third was escorted from his office in City Hall, his tie askew, his voice cracking as he demanded to see the mayor. The mayor himself, Richard Calloway, watched from his office window, hands gripping the sill. He had not been charged, at least not yet, but the message was clear. His silence, his tolerance of McAllister's arrogance had carried a price, and now that price was being paid in front of the entire town. By 7 o'clock, Fairview buzzed with the news. People lined the sidewalks as black SUVs rolled away, carrying with them the men who had once carried unchecked power. Lydia Ramos stood outside the Café, apron still on her eyes, wet with relief. Harold Pierce leaned on his cane, whispering, "Took long enough." Tommy Jackson clutched his sketchbook, a new image forming in his mind, not of Mercer alone, but of agents moving in unison, the dawn breaking as justice arrived. At 8:30, Agent Chen stood before a bank of microphones in a temporary press conference set up outside the federal building. Cameras flashed as she read the charges aloud. Today, arrest warrants were executed against Officer Brent McAllister, Chief Alan Drummond, and 3 municipal officials of Fairview. Charges include violation of civil rights, conspiracy to deprive citizens of constitutional protections, and obstruction of justice. This action demonstrates that no one, regardless of badge or office, is above the Constitution. Her voice carried steady, clipped, undeniable. The same calm certainty Mercer had carried in Henderson's Café now stood in her words, amplified by federal authority. By 10 o'clock, national news outlets had picked up the story. Clips of McAllister's confrontation with Mercer played alongside footage of his arrest. Commentators debated the implications, how one officer's arrogance had exposed an entire system, how a small-town café had become the epicenter of a federal reckoning. And by noon, Fairview itself began to shift. For the first time in years, people spoke openly. Stories long buried came to light. Citizens who had once whispered their experiences now gave statements, their voices steady, protected by the knowledge that silence no longer shielded the powerful. At dawn, the arrests had been executed. By midday, the illusion of invincibility was gone. McAllister, Drummond, and their protectors were no longer untouchable. They were defendants, and Colonel David Mercer, once just a quiet man with black coffee, had become the symbol of what calm resistance could unravel. By sunrise on Monday, just 48 hours after the coordinated arrests, Fairview felt like a town holding its breath again, but this time it wasn't out of fear. The old order had been broken. Officer Brent McAllister, Chief Alan Drummond, and 3 city officials sat in federal custody, their mugshots already circulating across state news outlets. The illusion of invincibility, cultivated over 8 years and protected by silence, had collapsed in the span of a single dawn raid. At 8 o'clock, federal oversight formally took control of the Fairview Police Department. A team of agents and legal specialists set up offices inside the station, their crisp suits and clipped voices replacing the casual arrogance that had once filled those halls. A new chief was appointed on an interim basis, Andrea Williams, a veteran of the state police with a reputation for integrity and a record of dismantling corrupt systems. Her first act at precisely 9:15 was simple but symbolic. She gathered the remaining officers in the briefing room, the same place where McAllister had once strutted, and Drummond had once shielded him. "You are officers of the law," she said firmly, her voice steady as steel. "But from this moment forward, you are also guardians of the Constitution. If you cannot meet that standard, you will not wear this uniform." By noon, a restructuring plan was announced. Officers unwilling to embrace reform were offered the choice, retraining, or resignation. 6 chose resignation within the first week, men and women who had grown too comfortable in the old culture of silence. Those who remained entered mandatory programs in constitutional law de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. The training was not a box to be checked. It was a requirement overseen by federal monitors who reported weekly to Washington. The citizens noticed the changes quickly. By the second week, routine traffic stops were conducted with care rather than aggression. By the third week, body cameras were not only on, but reviewed regularly, their footage archived in federal databases. By the end of the first month, community meetings were scheduled every Thursday evening, giving residents a voice that had long been dismissed. For the first time in 8 years, Fairview felt less like a town policed and more like a town protected. And through it all, Colonel David Mercer remained what he had been from the beginning, calm, steady, present. He returned to Henderson's Café every Tuesday morning at exactly 8 o'clock and took his usual seat on the third red stool from the left. But the atmosphere was different now. The silence that had once pressed against the walls when Officer McAllister entered had been replaced by quiet respect when Mercer did. Lydia Ramos noticed it first. She poured his black coffee with steady hands, no longer trembling, and set it gently in front of him. "Good morning, Colonel," she said, her voice warm, carrying a reverence that wasn't about rank, but about recognition. He nodded, offering his familiar, understated "thank you." And though the exchange was small, it carried the weight of everything that had changed. Harold Pierce, seated at his usual booth, no longer avoided Mercer's gaze. Instead, he raised his cup in a silent toast, a gesture of gratitude from a man who had once let fear freeze his voice. Mercer returned the nod, an unspoken acknowledgement that silence had given way to awareness. But it was Tommy Jackson who carried the moment furthest. Sitting in the corner booth with his sketchbook open, he captured Mercer again, but this time his pencil didn't draw confrontation. It drew legacy. He sketched Mercer seated calmly at the counter, coffee in hand, but around him he sketched light lines radiating outward, touching the other patrons, touching Lydia, Harold, even himself. It was a sketch not just of a man, but of an idea that calmness could dismantle arrogance, that silence could resist, that truth could outlast intimidation. By the time Tommy turned 18, the sketch had become more than a drawing. It was framed on his bedroom wall, a daily reminder of the morning when one man's stillness shifted the course of his town. Inspired, Tommy chose to study criminal justice at university. His professors noticed his unusual clarity, the way he spoke not in abstractions, but in lived truths. In his final year, he wrote a thesis titled "Authority versus Power, a Model for Constitutional Policing." In it, he dissected the difference between the false power McAllister had wielded and the real authority Mercer embodied. He argued that policing should not be built on fear, but on law, not on intimidation, but on trust. His thesis was cited by reform advocates and shared in federal training seminars. One line stood out above the rest: power demands obedience. Authority earns respect. A badge without integrity is noise. A citizen with truth is thunder. Back in Fairview, the transformation continued. By the 6-month mark, the police department bore little resemblance to its former self. Officers walked beats in neighborhoods they once avoided. Community members who had long stayed silent now spoke at meetings, their voices steady, their stories validated. And every Tuesday morning, Mercer's presence at the café reminded them all how it began. Not with a riot, not with violence, but with black coffee, and the refusal to bow to arrogance. At 9 o'clock one Tuesday morning, Lydia leaned against the counter, watching Mercer read his newspaper. "Funny, isn't it?" she said softly to Harold, who sat at his booth. "How one man sitting quiet changed everything." Harold chuckled, shaking his head. "Not funny," he said. "Necessary. We just didn't see it until now." Tommy, sitting nearby, smiled faintly as he sketched the scene again, adding a caption beneath the lines, "Legacy isn't loud. It's lasting." By the end of the year, Fairview had become something no one expected a model. Federal reports praised its transformation, citing its retraining programs and community integration. Requests for its protocols came from 12 other jurisdictions, even from bases across the country. The story of Fairview, once a cautionary tale, had become a blueprint. And still, every Tuesday, at exactly 8 o'clock, Colonel Mercer walked into Henderson's Café, nodded to Lydia, accepted his black coffee, and sat quietly on the third red stool from the left. Not for recognition, not for applause, but because routine was a form of peace, and because legacy once forged did not need to announce itself. What happened in Fairview is more than a small-town story, it is a mirror for America. One officer's arrogance left unchecked for 8 years, buried under 42 ignored complaints, nearly collapsed an entire community's relationship with a military base that supported 3,000 families and poured millions of dollars into the local economy. But here's the lesson: all of it changed, because one man chose calm over chaos, truth over silence, and authority, rooted in principle, over the illusion of power. Colonel David Mercer never raised his voice, never drew a weapon, never sought attention. He simply documented, resisted, and endured. And because of that, the entire town transformed. For American citizens, the call is clear. Silence in the face of injustice is not neutrality, it is complicity. Lydia Ramos, Harold Pierce, and Tommy Jackson each began silent, bound by fear. But when truth finally surfaced, they found their voices, their courage, and even their purpose. Tommy's journey from a teenager sketching in the corner of Henderson's Café to a young man writing authority versus power is proof that the next generation is watching, learning, and ready to carry the torch if we leave them examples worth following. We must remember that democracy is not self-sustaining. It demands vigilance. It demands accountability. And sometimes it demands the courage to pull out a phone press record and say, "This is what happened." In a nation of more than 330 million people, no community is too small to matter. No café too ordinary to become the stage for justice. Fairview learned the hard way that real security does not come from intimidation. It comes from protecting the rights of every citizen regardless of rank, color, or silence. If this story moved you, if you believe America needs more examples of calm strength standing against arrogance, then I invite you to act. Subscribe to this channel to hear more stories like this one, stories that expose the difference between real authority and false power. Click like to push this message higher so more people see it. Share this video with your family, your friends, your community. Because when truth spreads, silence breaks. And when silence breaks, change becomes possible. The time is now, the responsibility is ours.